The slap landed before the bell above the door had finished ringing. It was not a theatrical blow, not the sort of thing that cleared a room with noise and spectacle. It was precise, almost domestic in its efficiency, the kind of strike delivered by a hand long accustomed to its own authority. The sound of it was small in the crowded workroom, a dry crack beneath the chatter of the Mayfair street outside, and for one suspended moment, every needle in the room paused in its cloth. Nell Hartley did not stumble. She stood at the center table with her hand still raised from the bolt of ivory sarcenet she had been measuring, her left cheek burning in a clean stripe, and she looked at Lady Dorothea Ashford with an expression so composed it might have been mistaken for indifference by anyone who did not look closely enough. A man in the doorway was looking closely enough. She did not see him yet. She was still looking at the woman who had struck her, noting the particular tilt of Lady Dorothea's chin, the way the diamonds at her throat caught the gray morning light from the long windows, the way her gloved hand had not yet lowered. Nell was aware of the junior girls pressing themselves against the far wall, aware of Mrs. Paget's sharp intake of breath from behind the partition, aware that the silence in the room had a shape and a weight, and that she alone was responsible for what would fill it. She lowered her own hands to the table. She smoothed the sarcenet flat. "I will need the measurements corrected before Thursday, my lady," she said, in a voice that contained nothing that could be used against her. What she did not know was that the man in the doorway would remember those 7 words for the rest of the season. Nell had worked in Mrs. Paget's modiste on Bond Street for 14 months by the February of that particular year, and in all that time she had learned to become invisible inside the workroom's long, narrow hours. She arrived before the other girls, her gray wool dress brushed to its cleanest sheen, and she took the hardest commissions without complaint. The beaded court trains that left your fingers raw, the riding habits with their exacting seams, the presentation gowns that allowed no alteration once the measurements were confirmed. She was paid 12 shillings a week for this work, which was more than the junior girls and less than Mrs. Paget's cutter. And it was enough to keep a single room near Marylebone and to send a small quarterly sum to her aunt in Bath. The 12 shillings mattered. The room in Marylebone mattered. And so Nell had learned, early and thoroughly, that her opinions were a luxury she could not yet afford, that her education, which had been rather better than anyone working in a modiste's had cause to expect, was most useful when it remained unannounced. She had been the second daughter of a clergyman whose living had been modest and whose library had been extensive. Her father had taught her French and Latin alongside her brothers, had set her to read Voltaire and passages of Virgil as calmly as he had set her to mending, and had died of a lung fever when she was 19, leaving the living to revert and the library to be sold in lots. Her brothers had gone into trade. Her older sister had married a merchant in Bristol. Nell had come to London with £30, a good education, and the practical knowledge that a needle could be held in a way that did not betray what the hand holding it already knew. Mrs. Paget had hired her without ceremony. "Your tension is even," she had said, inspecting a sample seam, and that had been the whole of the interview. There was one thing Nell knew that Mrs. Paget knew also, though neither of them had occasion to say it aloud to the customers who swept through the shop door in their carriages and their fur-trimmed mantles. 3 months before Nell's arrival, Mrs. Paget's establishment had been commissioned by a correspondence routed through the Lord Chamberlain's office to supply 3 court mantuas for a presentation ceremony. The total commission was £300, and the lead seamstress named in the paperwork had been Nell Hartley, because she was the only girl in the workroom who could read the French pattern notation that accompanied the royal specifications without assistance. Nell had read those notations aloud, at her table, without thinking about who else was in the room, and that was where everything had quietly begun. Lady Dorothea arrived on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of February. She came for a fitting of a reception gown, attended by Miss Cecily Vane, who wore white muslin with embroidered primroses and an expression of mild contempt distributed democratically across everything below her own station. Lady Dorothea was perhaps 40 years old, slim and dark-haired, with a widow's precision in her mourning replaced by half-mourning dress, and the kind of social confidence that did not require raised voices or explicit cruelty to make its weight felt. She was the Duke of Clarendon's widowed sister-in-law, a fact which granted her an authority in London, drawing rooms that she had spent 6 years cultivating to a fine edge. She had never been inside Mrs. Paget's workroom before. Customers were received in the front fitting rooms. What brought her through to the back, where the bolts were stored and the girls were working, was a question she put to Mrs. Paget's assistant about a particular shade of rose silk she wished to inspect from the bolt, a question the assistant could not answer, and so the assistant had opened the workroom door, and Lady Dorothea had followed her through without waiting for an invitation. Nell was at the center table measuring the sarcenet. She was closest to the door. Lady Dorothea looked at her and said, with no particular emotion, "You there. Fetch me the rose silk from that shelf." Nell looked up from the bolt. She considered in the fraction of a second available to her whether to explain that she was the lead seamstress engaged on a court commission, or whether that information would make the encounter shorter or longer. She chose shorter. She turned toward the shelf. "Don't turn away from me when I am speaking," Lady Dorothea said, and the slap arrived on the pivot. So that was the order of it. That was the geography of the morning. The workroom, the bolt of sarcenet, the diamonds at the throat, the dry crack of the strike. And Nell Hartley's composed face turned 3/4 toward the door, where a man stood holding his hat in one hand, entirely still. The Duke of Clarendon was 32 years old, tall in the way that comes from years of outdoor habit rather than performance, with a jaw that gave nothing away, and gray eyes that had been trained, over a long time and at considerable cost, to deliver the same quality of attention to every object in a room. He was not handsome in any expected way. He was arresting in the way that a particular kind of winter sky is arresting, not beautiful but impossible to look away from, because something in its quality suggests it is about to change. He had come to collect a cravat order placed by his valet. It was a small errand unworthy of a duke, and he had undertaken it himself because he had been in the neighborhood on other business, and because, if he was honest with himself, he had found that a specific Tuesday occupied his attention with no reasonable explanation. He had not been honest with himself about that yet. He watched Lady Dorothea's hand lower. He watched Nell smooth the sarcenet flat. He watched her speak her 7 words to a woman who had just struck her without cause, and something in the quality of his stillness changed, though it would have been nearly impossible to name how. Lady Dorothea became aware of him at precisely the moment he took a step into the room. "Your Grace." Her voice was warm and managed, no trace of the hand's recent employment. "I was not aware you were expected. I am here for my fitting. Paget has been keeping me waiting." "Mrs. Paget has not kept you waiting," he said, in a voice like a closing ledger. "You came into the workroom uninvited." Miss Cecily, who had been standing at the doorway with her primrose muslin and her democratic contempt, went quietly attentive. Lady Dorothea's eyes moved to Nell with a brief sharpening. "The girl was impertinent." "I heard the exchange from the street," he said, and the simplicity of this information contained a judgment so plain it required no elevation. He turned then toward Nell. He looked at her for a moment with the gray-eyed quality of attention that did not parse status before it processed a person. "Are you injured?" he asked. It was a question with no practical reason behind it. A seamstress's injury was not a duke's concern. Nell was aware of this. She was also aware with a faint, inconvenient precision of the specific manner in which he was waiting for her answer. "No, Your Grace," she said. He looked at her for one beat longer than the question required. Then he turned back toward the front of the shop to find Mrs. Paget, and the temperature of the room resumed something approaching its ordinary register. And Nell returned her attention to the sarcenet, because 12 shillings a week did not leave room for anything else. If you have ever stood in a room where a verdict has just been rendered against you by someone who did not know your name, you will understand something of what Nell's daily occupation required. Stay with her now, because the things she endures across the next weeks are not incidental to who she is. They are the measure of her. Lady Dorothea did not forget the seamstress who had not flinched. In Nell's experience, people who expected flinching and did not receive it rarely forgot the deficiency. The following week brought a small, specific difficulty. One of the junior girls, a 14-year-old named Betsy with clever hands and more nervousness than was good for her, had been assigned to press and finish a court train commissioned for a presentation ceremony in March. The train was heavy ivory satin, embroidered with silver thread, and Betsy had pressed it with the iron too hot and left a faint scorch along 6 inches of the inside hem, invisible when worn but present when examined, and the examination, if it came, would come from someone whose opinion of Mrs. Paget's establishment was connected directly to the royal warrant. Betsy had found Nell at her table, white to the lips, holding the scorched section up to the window. Nell looked at the scorch. She looked at Betsy. She looked at the clock on the wall, which said 7:15 in the evening, and at the empty room. And then she took the train from Betsy's hands without explanation, sat down at her own table, and spent the next 3 hours reworking the inside hem in an invisible stitch that incorporated the damage into a deliberate lining fold that would hold under examination. She sent Betsy home at 8 o'clock. She told her nothing had occurred. She did not know that the workroom door had been opened, very quietly, at 9:30, and that a man had stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching a woman stitch silver thread into ivory satin by a single tallow candle, her spine straight and her hands certain, and that he had then, with equal quietness, stepped back and pulled the door closed behind him. He had come to leave a note for Mrs. Paget about a second order. He had not needed to open the workroom door to do it. He had done so anyway, with no practical reason he could name. The French pattern notation was the third thing. He came into the workroom on the pretext of the second order in the middle of a Thursday morning when the light was good, and Nell was at the central table with the specification sheets for the court mantuas spread before her, reading the instructions to herself in a low voice, working through a particular construction challenge in the collar mounting that required a technique the notation described in formal Parisian dressmaking French. She was saying, to no one, "Non, pas un pli couché. Il faut le tourner en biais pour que le grain suive le collet," which meant, roughly, that it was not a flat fold, but a bias turn, so the grain would follow the collar. And she was so absorbed in the geometry of the problem that she did not hear the door until she had finished the sentence. He was standing at the entrance to the workroom with an expression that was not his usual quality of controlled neutrality. It was something adjacent to recognition, swift and involuntary, a look that asked a question he had not decided to ask. "The collar," he said. "The bias turn. You are correct." Nell looked up. She held the specification sheet steady. "Your Grace, where did you learn technical French?" The question was direct and carried no condescension. It was the question of a person who wished to know the answer. "My father taught me," she said. "He was a clergyman. He believed languages were practical." There was a pause in which several things existed simultaneously. The workroom, the specification sheets, the quality of the morning light on the central table, and the fact that he was still standing in the doorway with no order to collect and no practical reason to remain. He was correct, the Duke said, and left. Nell sat with the specification sheets for a moment longer before returning to the collar notation. She was aware of a small, dangerous warmth somewhere in the region of her sternum, which she addressed with the same methodical attention she brought to a difficult seam, pressing it flat, smoothing it even, tucking its edge well out of the way. He was a duke. She was earning 12 shillings a week. The arithmetic of the situation was not complicated. It was in the week after the French notation exchange that she saw the letter. She had been passing through the front hallway of the shop with a delivery parcel when he arrived to speak with Mrs. Paget about the Royal Commission timeline. He was pulling off his gloves in the small front reception room, and the motion disturbed the inner pocket of his coat enough that a folded piece of paper slipped and fell to the floor. He picked it up with a speed that was not quite composed, and for a moment, holding the letter in his bare hand, he was someone entirely different from the man who asked questions in doorways. The letter was old. The paper had the particular softness of something handled many times. The handwriting on the outside was young and quick, slanted letters not yet settled into their final form. Nell could see only the first line of the address before he folded it closed, but that was enough to understand that it had been written by someone who had not expected to die young, someone who had written with the careless confidence of a person who believed there would be more letters to come. She kept walking. She delivered the parcel. She did not look at his face when she passed him again in the hallway, because some wounds are private, and the sight of them is not for the uninvited. What she carried away from that hallway, without examining it carefully, was the knowledge that the Duke of Clarendon was not cold in the way she had first supposed. He was cold in the way that people become who have held something warm and lost it, who have rebuilt their surface into a material that will not conduct grief outward where others can see it. That was a different thing entirely. It did not resolve the arithmetic of 12 shillings and a dukedom. But it was a different thing. His younger brother had been Lord Henry Ashford, dead of a fever in India 3 years before, at 24 years old. Nell would not learn this name for some time. But she had seen the letter, and the letter had done its small, quiet work on her understanding. Lady Dorothea moved in the 3rd week of February. She had connections throughout London's dressmaking trades that she had never had occasion to use directly, but a word to the right receiving room was sufficient. Mrs. Paget's principal cutter was told, through a social chain that required no direct attribution, that Lady Dorothea Ashford had found the workroom staff insufficiently managed and that certain clients of her acquaintance were reconsidering their custom. Mrs. Paget, who was a practical woman and who depended on the custom of women in Lady Dorothea's circle for nearly a third of her revenue, came to Nell on a Friday morning with the particular look of a person delivering news she would prefer not to deliver. "I must let you go," she said. "I am sorry, Nell. I have no choice in the matter, and I hope you know that." Nell received this without visible alteration in her expression. She asked for 1 week's notice pay, which was 9 shillings and not the full 12 because Mrs. Paget had already made up the difference in her head with a recommendation letter. She folded the 9 shillings into her purse. She went to her table and finished the collar she had been working on, because it needed to be finished, regardless of who had commissioned the stopping of her wages. The slander was already moving through drawing rooms by the following Thursday. Nell heard its outline from a girl she had worked alongside, a girl named Martha, who had a cousin in a ladies' companion position in Mayfair. The story making its way through those particular rooms was that a seamstress from Mrs. Paget's had been dismissed for carelessness with a commissioned piece, that she had ruined the item in question and attempted to conceal it, and that she had been, in any case, above herself, in the way she spoke to ladies who visited the establishment. The story had no named source and required none. It had Lady Dorothea's architecture in every detail. Nell sat with this information and performed the same operation on her anger that she had performed on the warmth in her sternum some weeks before. She smoothed it flat. She tucked its edge under. She would not seek another position in the same quarter because the slander would travel ahead of her. She would not write to the Duke because she had no right to his attention and no claim on his interest, and the fact that he had asked a question in a doorway did not constitute a claim. What she would do was complete the court commission. The Royal Commission had been suspended with her dismissal because she was the only person in the workroom who could execute the remaining 2 mantua collars to the specification. Mrs. Paget knew this. Nell knew this. She went to Mrs. Paget 3 days after her dismissal and offered to complete the collars from her room in Marylebone for no additional fee, because the commission belonged to the establishment and not to her, and because the work needed to be done correctly. Mrs. Paget looked at her for a long moment. "You owe me nothing," she said. "I know," Nell said. "The commission should be completed." She took the materials home in a cloth parcel and worked for 4 days by the window where the light was best. The charity exhibition at Clarendon House was a winter event of some social standing, an annual display of work produced by gentlewomen in reduced circumstances, organized under Lady Dorothea's patronage. Nell had no reason to attend, and every reason to stay away. She went because Martha's cousin had mentioned that the completed court mantuas would be on display as a centerpiece of the working craft section, Mrs. Paget having arranged their exhibition as a matter of professional pride, and because Nell needed to deliver the finished collars to Mrs. Paget before the display opened and there was no other suitable hour to do it. She arrived at Clarendon House in the first cold hour of the exhibition, wearing her gray wool dress and her plainest bonnet, with the finished collars wrapped in cotton lawn inside a paper parcel under her arm. The entrance hall was already filling with ladies in their winter silks, footmen circling with glasses of warm wine, and the quiet industry of a patronage event running smoothly under practiced management. She found Mrs. Paget near the display cases at the far end of the first reception room and transferred the parcel without ceremony. Mrs. Paget took it, examined the collars briefly, and pressed Nell's hand once before she turned back to her display. Nell was turning to leave when she heard Lady Dorothea's voice, carrying over the general noise from no more than 12 feet away. "The seamstress who made those mantuas?" Lady Dorothea was saying, with the particular gentleness of a woman choosing her words for maximum utility. She was speaking to a cluster of ladies that included Miss Cecily and 2 other women Nell did not know. Dismissed for careless work, a provincial girl who fancied herself rather more skilled than the evidence suggested. One does feel sorry for them. They often cannot help overreaching. The second voicing? A public room, a small audience, and a story polished since its first telling. The ladies made soft sounds of sympathetic agreement. Miss Cecily's eyes found Nell at the edge of the group, with an expression of considered recognition, the kind that calculates whether to speak or remain quiet, and chose quiet. Nell did not move immediately. She stood and heard the story told about herself, and she held the knowledge that it was untrue without displaying it, because displaying it here would serve no purpose and cost everything. She turned toward the door. "Miss Hartley." The voice was level, carrying, and placed in the room in a way that made several people nearby become still at once. It was not loud. It was simply the voice of a man to whom rooms belonged by inheritance. Edmund Ashford, the Duke of Clarendon, was standing at the entrance to the reception room with his hat still in his hand, as though he had arrived only moments before and come directly to this spot, which was, in fact, exactly what he had done. He had received a letter that morning from Mrs. Paget, not requested and not expected. A brief and careful letter that said only that the Royal Commission was now complete, that the seamstress responsible for the most demanding portions of the work had been dismissed under circumstances the writer would not detail, and that the collars had been delivered this morning to Clarendon House. Mrs. Paget, who was a practical woman, had said nothing in the letter that she could not defend, but she had said enough. He walked across the reception room in 3 strides. The room's attention, all those winter silks and warm glasses and soft conversational sounds, turned toward him as water turns toward a stone dropped into it, in widening rings from the point of impact. He stopped before Nell. He looked at her with the gray-eyed quality of attention she had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite, a concentration so complete it excluded everything not worth concentrating on. "You completed the commission," he said. "The work needed to be done, Your Grace," she said, "from your own rooms, after your dismissal, at no charge." He was not asking. He had already established these facts before entering the room. "I am told," he said, with a precision that carried no particular emotion, but filled the room's silence completely, "that the collar work on the court mantuas is the finest of its kind produced in London this season. I am further told that it was executed under a royal specification in formal French technical notation by a seamstress who reads that notation without assistance." He paused. Lady Dorothea had gone very still in the way of a person who has just understood that the room's moral weather has changed and cannot be restored to its previous temperature. "I understand there has been a mischaracterization of this work," he said, "and of the person who produced it, in certain drawing rooms of my acquaintance." His voice remained entirely level. "I am interested in correcting it." "Your Grace," Lady Dorothea said, from her position near the display case, and the word came out with less weight than she had intended. He turned his head toward her. "You will have occasion," he said, "to speak to me at some length about several matters. This is not that occasion." He looked back at Nell. "Miss Hartley, I believe the display of your work is in this room. I would like to see it." He offered her his arm. The room was entirely quiet now, the kind of quiet that has a color and a texture. Nell looked at his arm for one moment, the dark wool of his coat, the bare hand that had picked a folded letter off a floor, with such careful speed. She thought of 12 shillings. She thought of the ivory sarcenet, and the smoothed bolt, and the 7 words she had said that he had apparently stored somewhere he did not discard things easily. She thought of a Latin lesson in a cold rectory library, her father's voice patient over a Virgilian passage, his conviction that the world would eventually require what he was teaching. She took his arm. She felt through the cloth the quality of stillness that lived in him. Not coldness, but discipline. The held posture of a person who had learned to carry private weight without distributing it to everyone in the room. She understood. With the composed precision she brought to all difficult things, that she was walking across a room in which every person present was recalibrating a judgment they had made without sufficient information. She did not smile. Neither did he. But she was aware of his hand settling briefly over hers on his arm. The faintest pressure, there and then absent, a thing she could not have demonstrated to anyone but which she felt along her palm for the rest of the evening. They stopped before the display case where Mrs. Paget's court mantuas were arranged. The ivory satin of the collars caught the candlelight with the particular depth of fabric that has been handled with absolute precision. 3 or 4 people from the nearby cluster drifted closer, as people do when the room's most authoritative presence indicates something is worth looking at. "The French notation," the Duke said to the small gathered audience, with the same level particularity he had used all evening. The specification for these collars came from the Lord Chamberlain's office. The notation was technical Parisian dressmaking French. The seamstress who executed this work read that notation without assistance and produced a result that has received a written commendation from the Commission's reviewing officer. He turned to look at Miss Cecily, not unkindly, but with the gray-eyed attention that sorted what was true from what had been wished true. I should be grateful if that fact circulated as widely as certain other recent accounts. Miss Cecily's expression underwent a careful revision. She was not a cruel girl. She had simply been given a script her entire life and had followed it faithfully. The script, it appeared, had been written by someone who had not foreseen this particular room. Lady Dorothea had come to stand at the edge of the group, and Nell was aware of her there without looking directly at her. She heard the moment when Dorothea's social confidence, which had been a perfectly maintained structure, underwent its first public failure. Not a collapse, but a visible fissure. The sound of a woman who has been certain of her position, recognizing that she has occupied it at someone else's expense. "Edmund," she said quietly, "I only wish to protect the family's name from unsuitable attachments." "You have told me," he said, and his voice carried nothing that was unkind. "What do you wish to do? I am more interested in what you did." He looked at Nell. The room was still that particular color of quiet. "Miss Hartley," he said, and then with a deliberateness that altered the syllables into something formal and permanent. "Nell." He had not used her given name before. "I have been attempting to find a reason to return to a workroom on Bond Street every Tuesday since the 4th of February, despite having completed my business there on the first visit. I find I am less interested in pretending this is not the case than I was a month ago." He was not a man who made speeches. This was not a speech. It was the kind of statement that a person makes once, from the place where they keep the things they do not distribute to everyone in the room, and it was offered in a public space in front of witnesses with the full knowledge of what that cost. Nell's hand was still on his arm. She was aware of her heartbeat, not in the theatrical way, but the practical way. The way the body records things it intends to keep. "I have been," she said carefully, attempting to concentrate on collar notations. Something moved in his face. It was brief and nearly invisible, but it was there, a slight alteration around the corners of his mouth that in a more demonstrative person would have been a smile. In him, it was the equivalent. "That is a very sensible use of your time," he said. "I wonder if you might consider, given that the commission is now complete, directing some portion of that attention in a different direction." She looked at him. She looked at the room. She looked at Lady Dorothea, who was standing with the particular stillness of a person absorbing a lesson they had not known they needed, and at Miss Cecily, whose expression had completed its revision into something approaching genuine, and at Mrs. Paget, who was holding the finished collars with both hands and watching the scene with the composed satisfaction of a woman who had written a careful letter and received the correct result. "I believe," Nell said, "that might be arranged." He covered her hand on his arm once more, deliberately this time, and the room exhaled. The formal proposal came 2 days later in the smaller drawing room at Clarendon House, without witnesses and without ceremony, because he was not a man who required ceremony to mean what he said. He asked her plainly, seated across a small table from her in the early afternoon light, and she answered him with the same plainness, and they sat for a while in the winter quiet of the room before either of them spoke again. He told her about Lord Henry in that room. Not everything, Not the whole weight of 3 years, but enough. Henry had died of a fever at a military post in India, 24 years old, in the 4th year of a commission he had taken with the specific light-footed confidence of a younger son who believed his brother's rank would always be there to land against when the world became too heavy. He had been wrong, and Edmund had spent 3 years engaged in the private and exhausting work of understanding that love did not require its object to be immortal to be real, but that knowledge and peace were different things and arrived on separate schedules. The letter was still in his coat pocket. He had not decided what to do with it. Nell did not tell him what he ought to do with it. She simply said that she had seen him pick it up from a floor in a hallway in February, and that she had understood something from the care with which he held it, and that she was sorry about his brother. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He would have liked you extremely. He would have read French with you over breakfast and driven everyone else in the household to the edge of tolerance." It was the first time grief had become something in his voice that was not armored, and Nell received it steadily, because she had a rectory library in her own past, and she understood what it was to mourn a kind of education that no longer had its source. They were married in March, with the snowdrops just finishing in the Clarendon House garden, and the morning cold enough to see your breath in the porch of the parish church. Mrs. Paget attended and wept in a composed and practical fashion. Betsy, who had been retained in the workroom, and who had been told nothing officially, but understood everything, sent a small posy of early primroses by way of the footman who had been dispatched to Bond Street on the morning of the ceremony, with a note. Lady Dorothea attended also, because she was family, and because Edmund had made clear that the machinery of social consequence would run in one direction if she did not. And she sat in the second pew and held herself with the dignity of a woman who had been corrected in public and was now engaged in the long, unglamorous work of understanding why she deserved it. Miss Cecily, it emerged, had received an offer the following week from a perfectly suitable baronet, whose attentions she had been ignoring in favor of more ambitious prospects. She accepted him with what those in a position to observe described as genuine relief, as though the removal of the larger ambition had freed her to notice what had always been within reach. Nell heard this and thought no particular ill of her. She had been running someone else's script. She had stopped when it was made clear the script was wrong. That was something. The coda of it all, the part that settled into its proper shape, came in the long winter evenings of that first year at Clarendon House, when the snow that had been threatening since November finally arrived in January and made the park outside the tall windows into a still white field that seemed to breathe quietly in the evenings. Nell had claimed the small sitting room on the second floor as her own working room, not for seamstress work, but for the other work she had kept quiet for too long, the correspondence she had begun to take on as Edmund's household manager, the French letters from a Parisian cloth merchant who preferred to communicate in his own language and who had been delighted to receive, for the first time in 3 years of doing business with the Clarendon household, a reply in accurate technical French that addressed every point of his complaint in order. She was at her writing table on a January evening when Edmund came in from an afternoon meeting with his solicitor, still in his outdoor coat, with the cold air of the park on him. He stopped when he saw her at the desk. "The Parisian correspondence?" he said. He had 3 concerns about the summer order, she said. "I have addressed all 3. He stood in the doorway for a moment in the particular manner she had come to understand was his version of contentment, a quality of presence that asked nothing of the room because it was already satisfied with it. The fire was high in the grate. The snow outside had reached the lower panes of the tall window and lay there, still, whitening the evening light into something that had no edges. He came to the desk and set his hands briefly on her shoulders, a settled, familiar weight, and looked at the French letter she had been composing. He read 3 lines of it. "Your father," he said, "taught you extremely well." He believed languages were practical, she said. He was right. He moved to the mantelpiece, as he often did at that hour, and stood before the fire. On the mantelpiece, between a small clock and a blue jasper vase that had been in the house since his grandmother's time, was a folded letter, old enough now that the paper had softened to the color of cream. He touched it briefly with one finger, the way a person touches a thing they have decided to keep rather than lose, and then turned to look at her. Nell looked back at him across the warm room, with the snow pressing softly at the window and the fire steady at his back, and she had the particular, grounded knowledge of a woman who had pressed things flat and smoothed edges even for a long time, and who had finally, in a workroom and a hallway and a public room and a small drawing room in afternoon light, been seen without having to announce herself. Lord Henry's letter rested on the mantelpiece. The snow rested on the sill. The fire rested in the grate. She returned to the French letter, and she wrote, "If Nell's story stayed with you, leave a comment, and tell us which moment you were waiting for. The channel has more of these to come, and every watch and every kind word helps the next one reach someone who needs it."